The air in the ministry boardroom was stale with the smell of burnt tobacco and damp wool. A February fog pressed against the windows as a small brass kettle hissed on the radiator. The men seated around the polished oak table were engineers, chemists, and officers, some with grease still under their fingernails from the laboratories of Farnborough, others with the clipped precision of bureaucrats. At the far end, Dr. Harry Ricardo, the famed British fuel engineer, stood beside a chalkboard scribbled with equations and flowcharts. Behind him, a small glass flask of amber-coloured liquid sat beneath a label, isooctane, 100 rating. "Gentlemen," Ricardo began, tapping his pointer against the board, "this is not a theory. This fuel, when blended properly, resists detonation beyond 100 octane levels. That means—" He paused, meeting the eyes of an RAF officer. "Your Merlin engines can take higher manifold pressures, higher boost, without knocking. More power, same displacement." A murmur moved through the room. Across the Atlantic, 87 octane was standard. To the Americans, 100 octane gasoline sounded like alchemy. Colonel Raymond McKinley of the U.S. Army Air Corps, visiting from right field, shifted uneasily in his chair. He'd been listening for 2 hours, his notebook filled with cautious remarks. Ricardo pressed on. "Our tests on the Supermarine Spitfire prototype K, 9795, showed a 15% increase in climb rate and 20 additional miles per hour at 15,000 feet. These aren't trivial gains. They could mean the difference between catching a Dornier or being outpaced by one." McKinley cleared his throat. "Doctor, the Air Corps appreciates the demonstration, but our pursuit planes don't operate under those boost pressures. The Allison V-1710, for example, has no need for fuel that volatile." Ricardo frowned. "No need?" "You misunderstand, Colonel. Higher octane fuel unlocks that potential." Across the table, Major General Henry Arnold's liaison, Captain Everett Clark, interjected politely, "It's a question of cost, Doctor. We've barely standardized production on 87 octane. To move to a 100 rating would mean refinery overhauls across the continent." "And the British have done so already," Ricardo countered. "Standard Oil has the formula. It's not magic, it's chemistry and investment. Do you want parity with the Germans or not?" Clark scribbled something in his notebook. "Too costly, too unstable, not approved for mass use." By March 1940, memoranda flowed across desks at Wright Field, stamped rejected, not required for standard operations. The tone was polite, almost perfunctory. One circular from the U.S. Army Air Corps Materiel Division read, "While 100 octane fuel presents minor performance benefits under laboratory conditions, the risks of volatility, storage complications, and increased production costs outweigh projected operational advantages. Present 87 octane formulations remain adequate for Army aircraft." It was signed Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey, Assistant Chief of the Materiel Division, the same officer who would later champion the XP-38 Lightning. Irony, in wartime aviation, had a long memory. At the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, in Langley, Virginia, a similar skepticism brewed. Dr. George W. Lewis, NACA's Director of Research, circulated a technical note questioning the practicality of Ricardo's claims. "Engines of present U.S. design will not benefit materially from high-octane blends unless compression ratios and supercharger performance are redesigned accordingly. Such fuels are better suited for European engines employing higher boost settings." Lewis's conclusion: premature for adoption. Meanwhile, on the factory floor of North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, Chief Designer Edgar Schmude sat in on a seminar led by a visiting British liaison officer. Schmude wasn't a man of politics. He was a man of ratios, wing chords, and thrust lines. But when he heard the phrase "sustained 61 inches of manifold pressure using 100 octane blend," his pencil froze above the paper. He whispered to his assistant, Ray Rice, "That's..." Interesting. With the right airframe, you could push well beyond 400 miles per hour. Rice shrugged. Command says we're not changing the fuel specs. Waste of money, they say. Schmood didn't reply. He drew a small note in the margin of his pad. Check detonation limits, 100 octane versus 87, potential boost tolerance increase. The meeting ended without fanfare. The liaison left, the engineers went back to their drafting boards, and the proposed adoption of 100 octane fuel was shelved by American procurement officers. But Schmood quietly filed the data in a folder labelled Experimental Performance Enhancements. It would stay there untouched for nearly 2 years, until a war half a world away made that unwanted proposal a necessity. By summer 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, the true value of 100 octane fuel revealed itself. RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes, running on the Anglo-American blend refined from leaded isooctane and toluene, clawed higher into the sky and dove faster than the Luftwaffe had anticipated. Captured German reports later admitted astonishment. British fighters appear to have achieved unnatural boost levels. Our Messerschmitts cannot match acceleration beyond 15,000 feet. In London, the Air Ministry recorded those words with quiet satisfaction. In Dayton, Ohio, they were read with embarrassment. The Americans had turned down the fuel that had just helped save Britain from annihilation. At Wright Field, a young engineer named Russell G. Robinson wrote in his journal that autumn, "They say the British were mad to push that fuel. I think they were mad like foxes. Someday we'll need it. Someday we'll be the ones who are behind." And on the other side of the country, Edgar Schmood reopened that same folder labelled Experimental. He looked at the scribbled note, Check detonation limits. Then, beneath it, he drew 3 words. Next Fighter Project. He didn't know it yet, but the rejected additive he'd quietly kept on file would one day make his next aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, the fastest piston-engine fighter of the war. The telegram arrived on a mild April morning in 1942, its phrasing short and clipped, British understatement wrapped in urgency. Request: single-seat fighter of advanced design. Airframe compatible with Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Performance to exceed existing Curtiss P-40. Urgent procurement under Lend-Lease. Stop. RAF Purchasing Commission, Washington, D.C. At North American Aviation, the message was delivered to James H. Dutch Kindleberger, company president and engineer. He read it twice, then passed it to Edgar Schmood, his German-born chief designer, whose expression tightened. "The British want a new fighter," Kindleberger muttered, tapping the paper. "Not an improved one." "A new one, from scratch, 90 days for the prototype." Schmood leaned back, eyes distant. They've seen what the Spitfire can't yet do at long range. They want something faster, something that can climb higher, stay longer. Kindleberger smiled grimly. "And they think we can do it." "They're not wrong," Schmood said softly, "if they'll let us use the right fuel." The British Purchasing Commission, led by Sir Henry Self, had been visiting American aircraft firms for months. The P-40 Warhawk was already in British service under the name Tomahawk, but it lacked speed and altitude performance against the new German FW-190s. Self was frustrated. At Wright Field, he'd already heard all the reasons why 100-octane aviation fuel was unnecessary for US aircraft. He'd also seen the combat data from Europe that said otherwise. The RAF's use of 100-octane fuel had transformed their Merlin-powered fighters from desperate underdogs to high-altitude predators. Self now turned to North American Aviation with a specific challenge. "Gentlemen, the Curtiss design is outdated. We need something new, fast, long-legged, capable of escorting our bombers deep into occupied territory. We have the Rolls-Royce Merlin data. You have the factory. Build us a fighter." Schmood nodded, his mind already sketching lines in air. "And the fuel?" Self hesitated. The Americans still standardize at 87 octane, yes? Kindleberger smirked. Our procurement officers think 100 octane is a luxury item. Self's tone hardened. It is not a luxury. It is survival. Our engines thrive on it. The Merlin 20 and its successors require high boost. Without that fuel, your airframe will be strangled. Schmud simply said, "Then we'll build for the fuel, whether they approve it or not." Back at Inglewood, the design team began working under the project code N73X. Every night the drafting room glowed long past midnight. Blueprints stretched across tables, engineers arguing over laminar flow wing profiles and cooling systems. What made Schmud's approach radical wasn't only aerodynamics, it was anticipation. While others designed to match existing fuel, Schmud designed for the fuel that didn't yet exist in American service. He remembered his old notes, check detonation limits, 100 octane versus 87. From his desk drawer he pulled the folder marked Experimental. Inside were Ricardo's old British reports, yellowed at the edges. He told his lead engineer, Ray Rice, "We'll assume 100 octane as baseline performance fuel. That means higher boost pressures and more efficient supercharging curves. The Americans will catch up eventually." Rice frowned. "Won't that throw off the specs for Army evaluation?" "They'll thank us later," Schmud said quietly, "if they survive long enough to realize it." In the same weeks that the NA-73X took shape across the Atlantic, the RAF's technical department ran trials at Boscombe Down comparing 87 and 100 octane fuels in identical Merlin engines. The data was unambiguous. Horsepower increase, plus 150 horsepower at takeoff. Climb rate improvement, plus 600 feet per minute. Combat radius extension, plus 15%. An Air Ministry memorandum dated May 2, 1942, summarized bluntly. Continued superiority of high-octane fuel confirmed. Recommend all transatlantic deliveries include additive specifications for 100 octane production. The additive, a mixture of tetraethyl lead, isopentane, and aromatic hydrocarbons, had been perfected through collaboration with Standard Oil of New Jersey. Ironically, the same American refineries that dismissed the fuel as impractical were now secretly producing it for British use under wartime contract. By October 1942, the prototype NA-73X took flight from Minesfield, California, under test pilot Vance Breese. The results stunned even the skeptics. Maximum speed, 382 miles per hour at 13,000 feet. Handling excellent. Range, unprecedented for a single-engine fighter. The Air Corps took notice, though with skepticism. The Mustang was, after all, a foreign order. But when the reports reached Washington, a few visionaries saw something more. Among them was Colonel Oliver P. Eccles, who wrote a confidential memo to the Material Command. The Mustang's performance under high-octane conditions suggests untapped potential. Recommend examination of compatibility with Merlin's 61 engine and 100 octane fuel. That single line, tucked deep in a bureaucratic report, would set in motion one of the greatest transformations in aviation history. Meanwhile, on the factory floor, Schmud and his crew kept refining. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, designed to reduce drag, depended on the assumption of clean combustion, the kind only high-octane fuel could guarantee. Schmud didn't tell the Army evaluators, but the NA-73X's fuel system was already optimized for the volatile 100-octane blend. He once joked to Kindleberger, "If they ever try to run her on 87, she'll cough herself to death." The men laughed, but he wasn't exaggerating. In letters between Schmud and his colleagues, fragments of foresight appeared. The fuel is the secret weapon. The engine can't perform miracles on weak spirits. By December 1942, Britain had ordered hundreds more Mustangs, convinced that with the right engine and the right fuel, this unassuming American airframe could outfly anything in the sky. Late one night, Schmood stood by the half-finished fuselage of a Mustang Mark I, tracing his hand along the metal. "They don't understand it yet," he told Rice. "But when the Merlin meets this frame, and the tanks run hot with 100 octane, this will be the fastest thing that ever flew." Rice smiled faintly. "You sound sure of that?" Schmood nodded toward the dark hangar ceiling. "The Germans have their fuel. The British have their courage. We'll have both." He turned back to the silent Mustang. Outside, a light rain began to fall over Los Angeles, tapping softly against the hangar roof, as if echoing the ticking of time before the world realized that the war's deadliest speed would come not from a new weapon, but from a rejected fuel additive, waiting for its moment to ignite history. Snow drifted across the taxiways at Hucknall Aerodrome on a grey January morning in 1943. Inside the test hangar, the mechanics of Rolls-Royce Limited huddled around an American airframe that seemed almost out of place. Sleek, low-slung, its nose longer than the Spitfire's, its wings narrow and clean. Painted in dull camouflage green, the aircraft bore the stenciled markings Mustang Mark I, AM-121. Chief Test Pilot Ronald Harker walked slowly around the fighter, notebook in hand. He had flown everything in the RAF inventory, Hurricanes, Spitfires, Beaufighters, but this new arrival intrigued him. Its lines were unlike anything British designers favoured, elegant yet menacing, like a hunting animal built for long pursuit. But Harker's curiosity centred on the engine bay, not the wings. The Allison V-1710 that originally powered the Mustang sat removed, resting on a crate nearby. In its place, the mechanics had begun fitting the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage, two-speed supercharged marvel that gave the Spitfire Mach 9 its edge. Harker turned to Cyril Lovesey, Rolls-Royce's senior engineer. "You really think this will fit?" Lovesey grinned through his cigarette smoke. "Fit? It'll fit like a glove. The Yanks built a thoroughbred but gave it a cart horse's heart. Let's correct that. The idea had been born out of frustration. The Allison-powered Mustang was fast at low altitude, but suffocated above 15,000 feet, precisely where the air war in Europe was being fought. RAF pilots flying the Mustang Mark I over France had praised its range, but cursed its ceiling. Harker had written a memo to the Air Ministry the previous November. If married to the Merlin, the Mustang may well surpass the Spitfire in high-altitude performance. The airframe's efficiency and range, combined with the Merlin's boost, could yield a superlative escort platform. His report caught the attention of Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who authorised a trial at once. Rolls-Royce engineers were ordered to install a Merlin 61 into a Mustang airframe. By January 1943, the prototype was ready. They called it Mustang X. On the morning of January 13th, 1943, the air trembled with the sound of a new hybrid roaring to life. The Merlin's supercharger whine rose above the low hum of idling trucks. Mechanics stepped back, shielding their ears. Harker climbed into the cockpit, adjusted his oxygen mask, and gave a thumbs up. The tower crackled. "Hucknall Tower to Mustang X. You are cleared for takeoff." Harker advanced the throttle. The Merlin answered instantly, smooth and muscular. The aircraft leapt forward, wheels thudding over wet concrete. At 110 miles per hour, the Mustang lifted free of the ground, climbing like a startled bird. At 20,000 feet, Harker opened the throttle to 61 inches of mercury and smiled behind his mask. The altimeter spun higher. The aircraft climbed past 30,000 feet, an altitude the Allison could only dream of reaching, and still held steady power. When he landed 30 minutes later, Harker was nearly shouting as he climbed down the wing. "It's a bloody miracle! She runs like a Spitfire with the legs of a Wellington." The test data confirmed his excitement. Top speed, 432 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Rate of climb, 4,900 feet per minute. Range, 950 miles on internal fuel. For comparison, the Spitfire Mark 9 could barely manage 410 miles per hour, and the P-47 Thunderbolt needed half again as much fuel to cover the same distance. The difference wasn't just the engine, it was the fuel. The Merlin 61 demanded 100 to 130 octane gasoline, the same additive-rich blend that the Americans had once dismissed as unnecessary. The mixture allowed the engine to tolerate immense boost pressures, 18, sometimes 21 pounds per square inch, without detonation. That meant more oxygen, more fuel, more power. Harker wrote in his flight report, "The engine operates flawlessly on 100 octane. Suggest this fuel be considered standard for all future Mustang variants." Across the ocean at Wright Field, Ohio, word spread quickly. Colonel Oliver Eccles received the British test data by diplomatic pouch in February. The first page alone made him whistle softly. 432 miles per hour at 30,000 feet? He called in Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey, the same man who had once signed off the rejection of 100-octane aviation fuel 3 years earlier. Kelsey read the report silently, then looked up, almost embarrassed. "Guess we were wrong," he said. Eccles nodded. "The Brits built the prototype. Now we'll build the army of them." He drafted a memorandum to General Henry Hap Arnold that same afternoon. Recommend immediate production study for Merlin-powered P-51 variant utilizing Packard-built V-1650-3 engine. Estimated top speed in excess of any current Allied fighter. Endurance exceeds existing P-47 and P-38 platforms. Must adopt 100-octane fuel specification without exception. Arnold approved it within hours. The transformation began almost overnight. By mid-1943, the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit had secured a license to build the Merlin under American standards. The new engine was designated V1650-3, and every single one was designed to run on the rejected additive, the high-octane fuel blend now flowing across the Atlantic by the tanker load. Schmude's team at North American Aviation began modifying the airframe to accommodate the engine change. Revised cooling ducts, enlarged radiator scoop, new carburetor intake. The designation changed too, from P-51A, Allison, to P-51B, Merlin. Test pilot Bob Chilton took the first Merlin-powered Mustang aloft from Inglewood on November 30th, 1943. His flight report echoed Harker's from months earlier. "Unbelievable climb. Smooth power through all altitudes. Feels like she's flying downhill even when she's climbing." The Air Corps engineers watching from the ground were silent for a long moment before one muttered, "We've just changed the war." In the months that followed, production ramped at a dizzying pace. The first shipments of P-51Bs crossed the Atlantic under the Army Air Force's Ferry Command, fueled entirely with 100/130 octane gasoline, the same formulation that had once gathered dust in Wright Field filing cabinets. When the first squadron of P-51Bs arrived in England in late 1943, their arrival caused a stir among weary bomber crews. To the men of the 8th Air Force, who had been losing B-17s to German interceptors deep over Germany, the new fighter seemed almost mythic. One pilot wrote home, "They say she can stay with us all the way to Berlin and back. If that's true, then we might live through this winter." The rejected additive, the volatile, too costly 100-octane fuel, had at last found its champion. In the same Wright Field offices where it had once been dismissed, engineers now worked through the night perfecting production logistics for high-octane fuel distribution. The irony was not lost on them. One memo, unsigned but widely circulated, bore a handwritten note across the bottom. "Lesson learned. Never underestimate a chemist with a conscience, or a German engineer with a file marked experimental." The Mustang's transformation was complete, but its reckoning, the day it would prove to the world just how far that fuel could take it, was still to come. The winter of 1944 hung grey and bitter over the English countryside. Along the muddy runways of Debden airfield, mechanics in heavy coats moved like ghosts through the morning fog, their hands blackened with oil and frost. Row upon row of newly arrived P-51B Mustangs gleamed under the weak sunlight, each bearing the proud red and yellow checkerboard of the 4th Fighter Group. Inside the ready room, the men listened as Colonel Don Blakesley stood before a wall map of Germany, his jaw set. Pins marked targets deep inside the Reich: Munich, Leipzig, Berlin. For the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, those cities had long been unreachable death traps. Fighter escorts simply couldn't go that far. Until now. Blakesley tapped the map. "Gentlemen, we're taking the heavies all the way. No more turning back at the Rhine. No more leaving the bombers to fend for themselves. The Mustangs will stay with them, to Berlin and back." A low whistle went around the room. One pilot muttered, "That's 1,200 miles round trip." Blakesley nodded. "And we've got the legs for it. Fill the wings to the caps, top off the fuselage tank, and make sure your birds are fueled with 100 octane. That's what makes her sing." He turned toward his men, his voice firm. "You've all flown her now. You know what that fuel does. At 40 inches of manifold, she climbs like a banshee. At 60, she's untouchable. But respect it. Too much boost and you'll blow a jug clean off. The Merlin's got power, but she's got pride." Laughter rippled through the room, nervous but eager. Outside, the cold air carried the scent of high-lead gasoline, the same fuel that had once been called too volatile, too expensive, unnecessary. Now it was the heartbeat of the most feared fighter in Europe. At 0700 hours, flight crews moved to their planes. Ground men pulled starter carts into position. One by one, the Mustangs came alive, coughing smoke, then settling into the steady, throaty growl of the Packard-built V16507 engine. Each one burned 100 over 130 octane fuel, refined with tetraethyl lead and aromatic additives that let the Merlin withstand nearly double the boost pressure of older fuels. From the control tower, the order came. "Blue Flight, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed to Berlin." The Mustangs rolled down the runway in pairs, lifted smoothly into the low cloud cover, and banked eastward to rendezvous with the great bomber streams of B-17 flying fortresses already droning toward Germany. At 20,000 feet, the sky was a silver highway. Hundreds of bombers stretched across the horizon, their vapor trails curling like white ribbons. The Mustangs slid into position alongside them, glinting in the sunlight. For the men inside those bombers, men who had watched their comrades vanish to German fighters over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the sight of P-51s overhead was almost holy. A B-17 gunner named Tom Callahan wrote later in his diary, "They came with us past the Rhine, still there over Hanover. When the Focke-Wulfs came in from the sun, the Mustangs didn't turn back. They met them head-on. I'll never forget it, our angels with the Merlin roar." At Berlin Air Defense Command, German radar operators picked up the incoming formations at 11:15 a.m. Colonel Hans von Berg, staff officer under General Adolf Galland, studied the screen with disbelief. "Bomber formations, altitude 24,000 feet, but these escorts, they're still with them." The operator hesitated. "They should have turned back by now." "Distance indicates --." Von Berg snapped. "Impossible. No Allied fighter can reach Berlin." But within minutes, reports flooded in from Jagdgeschwader units scrambling near Magdeburg and Wittenberg. Enemy fighters sighted, new type, long range, extremely fast, not Thunderbolts. Mustangs with Merlin engines. In the skies west of Berlin, The P-51s tore into the intercepting BF-109Gs and FW-190As with surgical ferocity. Using superior climb and dive performance powered by high-octane boost, they dictated the fight from start to finish. Captain John T. Godfrey, leading Blue Flight, called over the radio. "Bandits at 1 o'clock high. Throttle 60 inches, don't let them drag you into the vertical. We own the altitude now." The Merlin engines howled as the Mustangs surged upward, pulling impossible climbs that no German fighter could match. The 100-octane blend burned clean and furious, giving the pilots bursts of raw thrust that turned the sky into chaos for the Luftwaffe. By day's end, the 8th Air Force claimed 68 enemy fighters destroyed, at a cost of only 4 Mustangs. Berlin had been bombed, and the bombers had come home. General Galland, reviewing the after-action reports, said quietly to his staff, "The day of the Jagdwaffe is finished. The Americans have the fuel of the future." In the following weeks, Allied intelligence compiled flight data that confirmed what the pilots already knew. The combination of the Merlin engine and 100-octane fuel gave the P-51 a combat radius of nearly 1,200 miles, double that of the P-47. Its sustained power at high altitude made it the first Allied fighter capable of dominating the air over Germany. NACA analysts at Langley, reading the reports, could hardly believe the performance tables. One engineer scribbled in the margin of a briefing, "If this is accurate, the Mustang achieves near-theoretical efficiency for a propeller-driven aircraft. The fuel, not just the airframe, is the key variable." Across the Atlantic, American oil chemists who had once dismissed the British Additive now worked frantically to expand production. The Bureau of Mines, Standard Oil and Shell Development all converted refineries for 100/130 grade output. The Additive, once labelled too costly for wartime use, became a strategic priority, guarded by armed sentries. A single gallon of it could buy an Allied pilot the extra speed to live through a dogfight. By spring 1944, the P-51 was rewriting the air war. Escorting bombers to targets once considered unreachable, Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, it gave the 8th Air Force the protection it had lacked for 2 brutal years. Luftwaffe losses mounted catastrophically. In 1 week of March, German fighter units reported 355 aircraft lost in combat against just 41 Mustangs. Pilots described their opponents' astonishment when the long-range Yanks appeared over the heart of the Reich. Lieutenant James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group later told a war correspondent, "We used to joke that we owed more to the chemists than the generals. The octane gave us wings. It let us use everything the Merlin had. You could climb past 30,000 feet and still have throttle left." In Berlin, the Reich Aviation Ministry commissioned a desperate technical study. The report, dated April 1944, admitted what no German officer wanted to say. "The Allied introduction of high-octane aviation fuel has rendered our existing engines inferior in sustained performance. Until comparable fuel synthesis is achieved, German aircraft will be unable to match Allied high-altitude endurance, but synthetic fuel from coal hydrogenation could reach only 87 to 92 octane, far short of the Allied blend. No additive in German production could equal the stability of the tetraethyl lead compound. In effect, Germany's pilots were fighting with half an engine. At Debden that spring, the Mustangs returned from missions blackened with exhaust and speckled with bullet holes. Ground crews refueled them from gleaming drums, stenciled 100/130 avgas, high lead content, handle with care. To the untrained eye, it was just another fuel. To those who flew, it was lifeblood. Colonel Blakesley wrote in a letter home that April, "We don't talk much about it, but every man here knows what makes this bird fly like she does. They called it a rejected additive once. Out here, it's what keeps us alive." By June 1944, as the invasion of Normandy loomed, the Mustang had become legend. Its range, speed, and altitude superiority had broken the Luftwaffe's back, clearing the skies for Operation Overlord. In the words of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, "Without the P-51, we could not have won air supremacy over Europe." And behind that supremacy was not just metal and courage, but a liquid, transparent, volatile, once dismissed as unnecessary. The same additive the Americans had shelved in 1940 now flowed through tens of thousands of aircraft engines every day, carrying them from England to Berlin and back again. History would remember the P-51 Mustang as the fastest piston-engine fighter of the war. But within the quiet pages of chemistry journals and refinery logs lay the truth of its triumph. A formula, rejected in peacetime as impractical, had become the secret weapon that conquered the skies. Inside the cavernous halls of Standard Oil's Bayonne refinery, steel pipes hissed and coils glowed orange under the glare of molten valves. Engineers in soot-stained overalls moved between vats of aromatic hydrocarbons, guided by the same additive that had once been dismissed by the U.S. Army Air Corps as too volatile and unnecessary. The chemist, Dr. Harold B. Thompson, tapped his slide rule against the console. "We're pushing her limits," he muttered, eyeing the pressure gauges. "But if we don't maintain the tetraethyl lead content within 2 parts per thousand, the fuel will detonate prematurely. The P-51's Merlin can't handle pre-ignition. She'll lose a cylinder before the test flight even leaves the pad." At NACA Langley, aeronautical engineers ran simulations to measure the effect of the new blend on engine performance. Charts of boost pressure, manifold readings, and knock tendencies littered the tables. One junior analyst scribbled nervously, "At 60 inches of boost, the P-51 achieves a climb rate 25% higher than previously recorded. Sustained operation possible, but cooling margins are narrow." Meanwhile, test pilots in modified Mustangs verified the numbers in real skies. Lieutenant Robert Johnson later recalled, "It was like the plane woke up. You could feel the extra octane in every throttle squeeze. The climb, the acceleration, everything improved. You had to respect her, or she'd punish you." Across refineries and laboratories, production scaled exponentially. Tanks once used for experimental runs were now dedicated to 100/130 octane aviation gasoline, while chemists worked around the clock to meet the demands of thousands of P-51s. Accidents were inevitable. Minor explosions and leaks were reported, but each mishap taught a critical lesson. It became clear the victory in Europe was as much chemical as mechanical. The additive, once rejected, had turned the Mustang into a machine that could outrun, outclimb, and outlast any Luftwaffe fighter. By summer 1944, every pilot knew the truth. The war in the air was won not only by courage, but by the careful hands of scientists, engineers, and refinery workers, whose unseen labour gave the P-51 the edge it needed to dominate the skies. The morning sky above Normandy was a wash of pale gold and steel grey, the kind of dawn that whispered both promise and peril. On the tarmac of RAF Boxted, a line of P-51 Mustangs gleamed under the autumn sun, their polished fuselages reflecting the flares of a distant skirmish. Pilots walked among them, inspecting panels, tuning radios, and running fingers along the Merlin engines that now carried a secret advantage: the once-rejected fuel additive. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Callahan, a veteran of 29 sorties with the 339th Fighter Squadron, ran his hand over the wing root. "Feels different today," he murmured, almost to himself. "You can smell the horsepower." Around him, the chatter of ground crews and engineers echoed like a chorus of preparation. Every bolt, every rivet mattered. Every drop of fuel had been tested for months, pushed to the limits in Langley Labs, refined at Standard Oil, and now waiting to prove itself in the crucible of war. By mid-October, the Allied strategic air campaign had reached a crescendo. German transportation networks were collapsing under relentless bombing raids, and Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled in increasingly desperate waves. On this morning, Callahan and his squadron were tasked with escorting a formation of B-17s bound for industrial targets near Dortmund. Intelligence suggested heavy opposition. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Division had been spotted refueling and arming at nearby bases, hoping to intercept the bombers before they reached the Ruhr. "Watch your six!" shouted Major Richard "Rick" Lawrence, the squadron leader, his voice cutting through static on the radio. "The Mustangs are fast, but the Messerschmitts aren't giving up without a fight." The P-51s took to the skies like silver arrows. Callahan pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine surge under the high-octane fuel. The Mustang climbed faster than any Spitfire or Bf-109 he had encountered, the Merlin humming with a restrained fury that no earlier models had possessed. Within minutes, the squadron broke through clouds, spotting 3 pairs of Bf-109s diving from 15,000 feet. The battle was brief but decisive. Callahan manoeuvred into position, the engine's high-octane blend allowing him to accelerate rapidly and evade enemy fire while lining up his own. Tracer rounds laced the air as he squeezed the trigger. The first 109 spiraled down in flames. The second followed seconds later. Reports after the mission would credit the squadron with 6 confirmed kills, with no Mustangs lost, a stark contrast to earlier air campaigns when escort missions often resulted in heavy casualties. At the 13th Fighter Command debrief, engineers and intelligence officers pored over telemetry and pilot logs. Every climb rate, fuel consumption rate, and engine temperature was noted. Analysts remarked on the Additive's role in sustained high-altitude performance, particularly in maintaining manifold pressure without inducing knock, a persistent problem in older octane formulations. "The P-51's superiority is no longer theoretical," one NACA analyst wrote. "Combat evidence confirms that the combination of airframe, Merlin engine, and high-octane additive creates a fighter capable of outperforming anything currently fielded by the Axis." Meanwhile, German reports painted a different story. Luftwaffe officers noted in captured diaries, "The Americans fly machines we cannot catch. Their altitude advantage is decisive. Our pilots are discouraged. Even experienced aces find themselves unable to climb fast enough to engage. The P-51s strike, then vanish like ghosts." By mid-October, the Allied air forces were virtually unchallenged over Western Europe. The Mustang's range allowed escort to deep targets in Germany, drastically reducing bomber losses. Fighter-bomber missions disrupted railways and factories, crippling the enemy's logistical capabilities. The additive that had once been dismissed as unnecessary was now silently tipping the scales of war. In letters sent home, pilots struggled to convey the feeling of superiority in the cockpit. Callahan described it simply. "You take off, and you feel like nothing can touch you. The Merlin roars, the wings hold steady, and you know that whatever comes at you, you can outclimb, outrun, and outfight it. The fuel, well, it makes the difference you can feel in every push of the throttle." Back at RAF Boxted, engineers celebrated quietly. They had ensured the additive reached the front lines safely, refined it for consistent performance, and solved the cooling challenges that plagued early tests. Every mission flown under the new fuel validated months of painstaking research. As October 1944 drew to a close, Allied air forces could claim control of the skies over France and Belgium, a fact corroborated by both combat statistics and pilot accounts. Enemy air resistance was now largely symbolic. The P-51, fueled with its once-rejected additive, was the ultimate instrument of air supremacy. In the air, victory felt instantaneous. On the ground, historians and strategists recognized a broader truth. A single chemical innovation, developed, tested, and almost abandoned, had reshaped the entire air war in Europe. Without it, the Mustang might have been a good fighter. With it, she became the fastest, most effective plane of the war. a weapon whose performance directly influenced the speed of liberation across Western Europe. The winter of 1944 in Western Europe arrived with a bitter sting. Frost clung to the wings of parked P-51 Mustangs, and the airfields around Liège and Antwerp were glazed with ice, their runways slick under the low December sun. Despite the chill, activity on the tarmac was relentless. Mechanics, bundled in oil-stained overcoats, moved with brisk efficiency, servicing engines, topping off fuel tanks, and checking every rivet and seam of the polished fighters. Lieutenant Harold Hal Simmons of the 339th Fighter Squadron walked along the line, his leather gloves tucked under the straps of his flight jacket. He paused at the nose of his Mustang, noting the gleam of the Merlin engine and the freshly applied insignia. "Cold enough to freeze your soul, but warm enough to fly," he muttered, half to himself. Around him, other pilots conducted similar rituals, a mix of superstition and discipline. Each man knew that this winter campaign would test the Mustang, and them, in ways they had yet to experience. By early December, the Allied advance toward the Rhine River had reached a critical stage. The Luftwaffe, though diminished, still posed a threat. German reconnaissance flights were frequent, and sporadic intercepts over Belgium had already claimed a handful of unescorted bombers. Commanders understood that control of the skies was a prerequisite for the success of the ground offensive. It was in this context that the P-51 Mustang, fueled with the high-octane additive, became indispensable. Major Richard Lawrence convened a pre-flight briefing in a heated tent near the Liège airstrip. Maps were spread across folding tables, each marked with lines and arrows representing bomber formations, anticipated enemy movements, and target zones deep in the Ruhr Valley. "Listen up," Lawrence began, voice cutting through the hum of heaters and the murmur of pilots. "We've got a strike against the industrial complex at Essen tomorrow. Luftwaffe is expected to scramble, but with our Mustangs providing top cover, losses should be minimal. Remember, climb fast, maintain formation, and trust the fuel. This isn't just 87 octane anymore. We've got the edge." The additive, though quietly implemented, had transformed the Mustang's performance in combat. At high altitudes above 20,000 feet, the engines now reached peak manifold pressures without hesitation, and pilots reported crisp throttle response and superior acceleration. In practical terms, this meant that a Mustang could now engage enemy fighters at will, dictate the terms of a dogfight, and disengage with confidence, a capability that had not existed a year prior. The following morning, the squadron ascended through a mist-laden sky. Frost crystals danced in the sunlight as the Mustangs pierced the cloud cover, revealing the sprawling industrial heart of Germany below. Bomber formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators advanced steadily, their defensive armaments bristling against potential interceptors. P-51s fell into position above and alongside, guardians of the skies. As expected, Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s and Focke-Wulf FW-19s scrambles from nearby airfields. What followed was a textbook engagement of altitude, speed, and firepower. Simmons, climbing to over 22,000 feet, watched the first wave of German fighters approach. With a twist of the throttle, made smooth by the high-octane blend, his Mustang surged past the 109s, diving into an attack with precision. Tracer rounds stitched through the grey clouds, and within minutes the Luftwaffe lost 4 aircraft, 2 more damaged and forced to retreat. The Mustangs sustained no losses in the encounter. By mid-December, operational statistics highlighted the additive's impact. Reports from 13th Fighter Command debriefs noted that Mustang pilots using the enhanced fuel additive experienced a 15 to 20% increase in climb rate at high altitude and a 10% improvement in sustained combat speed. Enemy claims of P-51 losses dwindled, while Allied bombers reported an unprecedented drop in casualties, validating the strategic value of the innovation. The additive's role extended beyond air-to-air combat. Mustangs increasingly participated in fighter bomber missions, strafing enemy supply lines and disrupting rail networks critical to German logistics. Simmons led one such sortie near Aachen, where the squadron destroyed a convoy of armoured trucks. The engine performed flawlessly under the stress of low-altitude operations, the additive preventing detonation and ensuring consistent power output. Pilots began to regard it as an invisible wingman, one that never tired and never faltered. Field intelligence officers noted the morale effect as well. German pilots, now aware of the Mustang's superior capabilities, avoided high-altitude engagements whenever possible. Diaries captured in post-war interrogations described feelings of frustration and inevitability. The Americans strike from above with impunity. Even the most skilled of us cannot close the distance. We wait, but the Mustangs decide when and where to fight. It is demoralizing. By the time Allied forces reached the west bank of the Rhine, the Mustang had earned an almost mythical reputation. Its ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, to engage and neutralize fighters before they could intercept, and to conduct precision strafing runs made it a cornerstone of air strategy. The additive, quietly integrated months earlier, was now recognized by pilots and engineers alike as a decisive factor in achieving air superiority. On December 20th, after a long mission over Cologne, Simmons landed his Mustang and watched the sun dip behind the clouds. He removed his helmet, allowing a gust of cold wind to whip across his face. In the distance, ground crews cheered as returning bombers touched down safely, untouched by enemy fighters. For a moment, the war seemed less chaotic, less arbitrary. It was the result of countless hours of research, meticulous engineering, and one serendipitous chemical formulation, the additive that had once been rejected. At the debrief that evening, pilots spoke candidly about the difference the fuel had made. Lieutenant Simmons, speaking for the squadron, concluded, "We fly faster, climb higher, and hit harder." The Mustang isn't just a plane anymore, it's a guarantee. And it's all because someone refused to dismiss an idea that seemed unnecessary. The winter airfields of Belgium and the Netherlands buzzed with that quiet confidence. Engineers filed the latest performance reports, pilots prepped their aircraft for the next mission, and commanders plotted the final push into Germany. The P-51 Mustang, fueled by its once-dismissed additive, had crossed the Rhine not just in flight, but in reputation, becoming an instrument that would shape the closing months of the European air war. By early March 1945, the Allied advance into Germany had accelerated. The Western Front, once a dense network of contested territory, was now a series of forward positions and liberated towns. Alongside the infantry and armoured divisions, the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAAF, had assumed near-complete control of the skies. Central to this dominance was the P-51 Mustang, now fully equipped with the high-octane fuel additive whose once controversial formulation had become a cornerstone of Allied operations. Airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands and Western Germany hummed with activity. Ground crews worked around the clock, servicing engines, inspecting airframes, and ensuring that each Mustang could operate at maximum performance. The additive allowed the Merlins to reach sustained high-altitude power outputs previously considered unsafe, giving pilots a decisive advantage over the remaining Luftwaffe forces. In the bitter wind of March, the Mustangs were not just aircraft. They were instruments of precision, morale, and intimidation. Captain James O'Connell, a veteran of the 339th Fighter Squadron, walked across the tarmac at a forward base near Aachen, reviewing flight plans with his fellow pilots. Intelligence reports had indicated that German fighter activity was concentrated around Dortmund and Essen, where industrial targets and transportation hubs still powered pockets of resistance. "We've done this before," he told the assembled pilots, "but remember, the Luftwaffe knows the Mustang now. They respect it. We need to remind them why." The morning sortie over the Ruhr Valley was a textbook demonstration of air superiority. B-17 and B-24 formations advanced toward industrial targets under the protective umbrella of Mustangs. O'Connell's squadron formed a high-cover echelon, climbing past 24,000 feet to intercept any approaching Luftwaffe aircraft. Within minutes, Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s appeared on radar, attempting to challenge the bombers. But as in previous engagements, the Mustang's combination of speed, altitude, and agility, enhanced by the fuel additive, rendered enemy maneuvers largely ineffective. O'Connell personally engaged a formation of 4 FW-19s attempting to dive on a bomber group. With the throttle pushed to near maximum and the additive stabilizing the fuel under high manifold pressures, his Mustang surged past the attackers, flanking them before they could react. Tracer rounds cut through the sky. One FW-190 exploded, another spiraled away smoking. By the time the squadron returned to base, enemy aircraft losses had outpaced Allied claims by a ratio of nearly 3-1, a testament to both pilot skill and the additive's performance. Beyond the tactical victories, the additive altered the strategic calculus for Allied commanders. Previously, long-range escort missions had required careful planning, often limiting the depth and timing of strikes. With the enhanced Mustang, pilots could climb faster, extend their operational radius, and sustain combat maneuvers at altitudes where the Luftwaffe could not safely follow. This capability allowed the USAAF to conduct deep penetrations into the heart of Germany, striking infrastructure, supply lines, and troop concentrations with minimal losses. At the 13th Fighter Command debriefing, O'Connell and his squadron submitted detailed performance reports. Flight logs highlighted the additive's effects. Sustained high-altitude engine output increased by 12 to 15%, preventing loss of power during extended climbs. Rate of climb improvements allowed Mustangs to reach intercept altitude 30 to 40 seconds faster than prior fuel formulations. High throttle response at low temperatures reduced engine hesitation during strafing runs and evasive maneuvers. These enhancements were not merely technical footnotes, they translated directly into operational dominance. German pilots, already demoralized from months of attrition, increasingly avoided engagements with Mustangs unless they had clear numerical superiority, a situation rarely achievable in early 1945. Field diaries and post-war interrogations reflect the psychological effect. Unteroffizier Karl Heinemann, a Luftwaffe pilot captured in April 1945, recounted, "The Mustangs did not fight like normal aircraft. They climbed like rockets and struck with deadly precision. To survive, we could not confront them at high altitude. We had to hope they ignored us. But they never ignored anyone." March also marked the Mustang's integration into multi-role operations. Beyond bomber escort, pilots were increasingly assigned ground attack missions, targeting rail lines, bridges, and supply depots to cripple German logistics. The additive proved crucial in these roles as well, ensuring engine reliability during low-level, high-stress maneuvers, where fuel volatility had previously caused dangerous engine knock or detonation. The result was a versatile aircraft capable of dominating both air and ground theatres simultaneously, something Allied planners had long hoped for but had only now fully realized. By mid-March, reports from the Strategic Bombing Survey indicated that Mustang escorts had contributed to a dramatic reduction in bomber losses, with missions into the Ruhr recording casualty rates of less than 5% compared to prior missions that had often exceeded 20%. The additive's contribution was discreetly noted in these reports, described as a critical enhancement to operational endurance and engine reliability. Yet its broader implications for air superiority remained evident in the daily success of Mustang missions. As Allied forces pushed eastward, the Mustang became a symbol of technological ingenuity and tactical evolution. Pilots took pride in flying an aircraft that combined speed, range, and maneuverability unmatched by any contemporary fighter. Engineers at North American Aviation continued to refine production and maintenance protocols, ensuring that every plane leaving the factory incorporated lessons learned from combat experience, including adjustments informed by the Additive's performance. On March 25th, the 339th Fighter Squadron conducted a final coordinated mission over Düsseldorf, targeting remaining transportation hubs. O'Connell led the flight, watching as Mustangs dived on rail yards, strafing trains and disrupting movement. Enemy flak was heavy, yet engine performance remained flawless. The Additive allowed the pilots to push throttle to maximum during evasive climbs, outmaneuvering flak bursts and returning safely. At the airfield, pilots dismounted and gathered near the briefing tent, their faces smeared with frost and exhaust soot. O'Connell addressed the group. "We've done something remarkable. Not just flying, but changing the game. These Mustangs, with that fuel, have given us the edge. Every bomber that made it home safely, every target destroyed, every enemy fighter sent down, that's thanks to the work of people in labs, on the tarmac, and in the air. Never forget that." The Mustang's reputation had solidified by the final weeks of the European War. Its speed, range, and reliability, enhanced by the once-rejected fuel additive, had allowed the Allies to achieve unparalleled air dominance, facilitating both strategic bombing and rapid ground advances. Pilots began to recount stories of Mustang sorties as legend, the aircraft itself becoming a character in the narrative of victory. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine and moved into central Germany, the Mustang had earned a place in history alongside the most influential aircraft of the war. Its story was not solely one of engineering triumph, but of innovation, persistence, and the recognition that even a rejected idea, carefully revisited and correctly applied, could change the course of a conflict. As March 1945 drew to a close, the Mustang, gleaming under the winter sun, taxied past rows of forward airfields, engines humming with reliability. Every sortie, every escort, and every strafing run underscored a truth that pilots had come to respect deeply. The combination of ingenuity, courage, and a single overlooked chemical additive had made the Mustang the fastest, most versatile and decisive plane of the war.